Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our regular Thursday Starman and the Zoomer stream. As you can guess by that joke, we're definitely sticking with. My regular co-host this week, Evelyn, is still with us. It
Hello.
makes it sound like you're like in danger of death or something. She's still with us, guys. Don't worry.
Yeah, I've not run away yet.
She's not. She's not escaped.
Mm.
Oh dear. How have you been then? We'll do a quick catch up before we get into the heavy stuff because this is going to be quite a not brisk, but there's a lot of information to pass here because it's going
Yeah.
to be quite an in-depth stream, I'd say.
Yeah, we'll try and do as we normally do and be a mixture of both concise but dense in information. No, I've been all right. Just been getting myself ready for the Shieldings thing, of course. Thank you very much to Rob, who's in the chat, for doing a reading and an edit of my speech. I've implemented some of the changes.
Yes,
uh,
that gives us a good kind of springboard to
I'm
to
not
launch into the.
I'm not done
Okay.
with my catch up of what I did.
Oh, okay.
No, I've been trying to read through the Juvenile. I'm slowly but surely just like creating like the digital version of like schizo scribblings for the full length sort of text form of democratization and researching some of the stuff for this stream. You know, the usual. Keep myself busy, cooking, cleaning. What needs to be done?
What must be done? Yes,
Yes.
very based and schizo-pilled. But that does, you have sprungboard, I've invented a word there, springboarded us onto a little bit of our shilling, which is, I know we talked about it during the live event stuff, but we will keep drumming on about this since we do have stuff to shill, which is that we will be at Shieldings starting on the 26th of this month. So that's next
Yes.
week, really. That's throughout the weekend. Tickets are still available. I don't know if we have a link in the description, but there's a link. I can never actually find the page when I want to actually shill it because shieldings is such a hard thing to remember how to spell. I can't spell anyway, but I'll put it in the side chat for people, and I might put it in the description when we're done here.
Yes.
We will. You're speaking there. I spoke there last year.
I think as
There's
well I might tomorrow I will quickly I'll not use all the slides and stuff as we were planning the other week because it's going to take me too long to put it on a Substack. But I'll throw up a edited version of my speech or not my speech, sorry, my entrance essay from last year that made it into the book, and also
yes.
I'll put that up as a preamble thing and sort of can help shill the shielding stuff because you know, as we have learned when it comes to organizing events, it's not the most difficult thing in the world. But that anticipating kind
Yeah.
of period for the last few weeks as you run up to it and the ticket sales tick away, and it's like, oh no, is it going to work? Is it not? It can be very stressful. So anything I think we can do to alleviate Maven's stress, we shall.
Yes, it would be. I do feel their pain over there at Shieldings, so we will try and show them. We're gonna probably try and we're gonna probably try and do it more heavily after Shieldings.
Mm,
But we do also have the Nomos stuff that is
yes.
coming up. We'll be running an event of our own 29th of October with a limited ticket kind of preamble meal, an early bird event on the Friday beforehand.
Mm,
So we will be trying to again bring more stuff into real life, but
yeah.
that's more by the by.
I think one last thing I might want to mention before we get into the rest of the stuff for this evening is maybe something we need to do some community posts about or have some feedback in comments or Telegram or wherever people want to give input. But we've been doing this for sort of semi-regularly now for over the last kind of nearly year and a half, and I think we've done quite a good job of it. And frankly, part of that is because I've sort of been willing to commit a lot of time to making content on here because I quite enjoy doing it. It gives me an excuse to go and research these things anyway, and I think it's not necessarily the worst use of time. However, at some point, there kind of needs to be some level of returns. And I understand there's members of the channel. There are people who generously super chat every once in a while, or they give a Streamlabs donation. But really, when we tot it up at the end of the month, it's sometimes for the hours that are committed to written and stream content. It's the return is like 15 pence an hour or something like that. So
Yes, it is a bit.
yes,
Well, it's not something that's particularly controversial. I do think we need to come up with a more structured content plan in some ways for
yes.
that, but we will be trying to come up with a more structured monetized content plan.
Mm.
Um,
Well,
yeah, there's
it's sort of
there's
it's a two-part thing really. We don't want to be in a position where we have to commoditize and make the content that we make a product first and foremost. I like the fact that we can sort of be a bit free form with it, and it means at times we can do longer stuff, shorter stuff. We can kind of talk about whatever we want because we don't have to look at it as a sort of profit sort of project. However, if people who are in the chat who are members aren't willing to commit more to get better content, then it never, we can commit as much time as we want to this. And if there's no returns, if people don't share the content around, if there is no active engagement, I know it's as you mentioned it the other week, it's like a really cringe thing. But at the end of the day, if you like a
it's
stream and you comment on it and you link it in groups or you link it on Twitter and relevant conversations, it gets a lot more traction than it otherwise would. It's just that simple. So we need the sort of combination of people being more active with the engagement of content and quite frankly people considering whether or not they wish to support us in the current state we are just now, because otherwise we will have to rethink about how we approach it and people might not like that. So
well, I think that there's also stuff to be committed on our end. We could do
mm,
with having a proper content schedule that people could see for us, see us sign up to. I don't know. It's something to consider in the future, and it would probably require, like I said, a bit more structuring what we do and some hard expectations on return. But I think we could do that. I don't think it's some like we're done with the events. I was worried that no one would show up. If you offer people a product or a service they want, people are willing to pay for it. So I think it's a matter of finding out what people want and figuring out how to serve that and figuring out how to it's a back and forth really. There's a real glut of this style of internet content. And as much as I like streaming, as much as I do want to keep streaming like this, it might be that we have to change our approach slightly
yeah.
to be able to get into that space. But it's just, I think what we're doing at the moment is it takes a lot of research to do. It's relatively easy, honestly, compared to what we could be doing.
No,
And
I
it's a
I mean
little,
that's the thing though, is that I mean I suppose the research we did for this week between us is maybe it's taken a handful of hours knocking together a thumbnail and stuff like that. It's not been as much as some other things, but the longer form content or the times where we will take a current issue and relate it to some sort of literature sort of source, that takes a lot more work because you need to be familiar with the literature, and sometimes that means
yes,
taking 50, 60 hours of a week and reading a book or reading a number of books so that you are at least on a surface level familiar with a thinker or a set of ideas. And I don't think that you should really be making content if you're not willing to make those commitments in the first place. But hey ho, that would probably mean cancelling half the people in bloody YouTube and in certain spheres, but that's enough of that. I
but
know Rob keeps saying in the chat about a book club. The only thing with doing a book club is that we could spend, or sorry, on my own, I could spend twice as much time as I do researching for a book club thing, and then there would be maybe a handful of people would turn up. And I don't know, that just doesn't seem like a perfect model to me. But maybe we need to have more conversations about it, Rob. Anyway, shall we get into
yes, we have
our
a lot to
subject
pass
today?
here, and I don't want to go on, past 10 minutes without actually getting to the content here.
Yes.
So, what we are here to talk about is Blackrock again.
Yep. I'd say we haven't mentioned it every week though. We've not been that bad. We're only going to say ESG once or twice.
Well,
This episode
I
hopefully.
what we're covering here is, I think, something a lot of people have not completely missed out on, but a lot of people seem to quite rightly, with the information they've been given, assume that BlackRock has either existed since like the 1950s and been a background presence, or it's kind of sprung full cloth out of nowhere in the 20-teens, in like 2018, 2019, when people just about started hearing about it. A lot of the material we'll see here from the later years, from 2018, 2019, is commenting on the fact that most people, apart from insiders in the finance industry, haven't heard of BlackRock up until that point. You know, they've played a massive role, and they're already the trillion numbers vary because there's direct investment versus management and, you know, helping funds and stuff like that. But the long and short of it is, by 2018, they were already like a $7 trillion company. By, you know, by whatever metric you want to put in there. And to a lot of people, they did just kind of come out of nowhere. But yes, as Rob rightly says in the chat there, a lot of people don't know the story really of how BlackRock not only capitalized on the 2008 crash, but codified itself essentially in federal regulation during that period, and codified itself as not only a market leader, but a market default, especially in the areas of technology.
No, entirely. They have arguably been one of the quote unquote pioneering sort of people in the financial sphere when it comes to the automated sort of trades and using algorithms to engage in valuation. And as we can probably get into it more as we come across it specifically, but that seems to me like something something that would give you immense amount of power, that you are the people that operate the, you know, one of the largest trading algorithmic platforms in the world, and you get to decide what makes up the algorithm and what influences it. That seems like an immense level of power to have.
Well, it's that also bundled with the other pies
Oh yes,
that
of course.
BlackRock has their fingers in. It's not just one thing. Once you start to realize cumulatively what they do, a lot of people talk about BlackRock's property portfolio, which they do have a lot of, and there's an awful lot of people we'll get onto later who are, you know, trying to debunk a lot of this. BlackRock, despite being a massive evil corporation that seemingly would be a target for the type of people who are very anti-capitalist, has a huge amount of defenders in the mainstream press. There's a lot of people who fact check criticism of BlackRock like they'd fact check, you know, a Trump speech. It's very on a surface level, it doesn't make any sense when you look at who BlackRock's allies are, and you look at who is shilling them and who thinks that they have a right to exist. Until you realize, you know, that they are essentially an overarching tool of the Federal Reserve System now.
Yes, they are almost kind of like the. I mean, I think there's the book. I can't remember the name of the guy that wrote it, but it's the Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and he basically describes the sort of work he did at like the IMF and the Bank of International Settlements when it came to essentially bullying third world countries and their governments. BlackRock is basically the Federal Reserve's arm for doing that. Oh, you still there? Oh, he's muted. I'm sure he'll be back in a moment.
Sorry, I was having a big sneeze there. I'm good. No, it is an entity that does that, and it has become. It's a very good demonstration, BlackRock, that there really isn't a difference between a private monopoly and when a government takes a monopoly. It very much demonstrates what happens when your monopoly gets kind of executive power, really. You have that system in place in which you can have the private public partnership. It really is one of the first examples of that.
Yeah.
Within the financial sector in the modern sense anyway. But yeah, we should probably get into some of the sources we have here, because we have first and foremost a bit of background information on BlackRock, and I've tried to separate this stream into acts to make it less confusing. But this is Act 1. It's a small loan of $5 million.
But just a pittance, my dear boy.
Yes, but a whiff, but a pittance, but a sniff of the financial cloud.
It's nothing to the $10 trillion man. How Larry
No.
Fink became king of Wall Street.
Well, there's two links we'll be using primarily for a lot of this actually. Um, one of them is this Financial Times link, and the other one is a Vanity Fair article, which is surprisingly.
Yes, the Vanity Fair article is a conversation in and of itself when we get to it, because that's from 2011, and much like, if you've read the Forbes article from like a similar period, I think it was 2010, like how the how the World Health Organization tried to fake a pandemic. It's like on that
Yes.
level of like, oh my God, people did actually write like really based, scathing, and exposing media as little as like 12, 15 years ago.
Well, it's amazing what you're allowed to write 12 years ago about BlackRock compared to what you're
Yes.
allowed to write now. Because again, the Financial Times piece here is a lot more watered down from 2021 than the Vanity Fair
Mm.
pieces, precisely because really, as soon as you start to criticize them in any kind of pointed way, you become someone who's against the establishment.
Yeah, I do like as well that in all of these, especially the modern ones we're gonna read, like they always like start to like really dramatize a story in the way that like if a like 12-year-old child was told to like write the story about the origin of BlackRock, they would start it with this paragraph here. April 16th, 2009, Rob Capito went to the newly built Yankee Stadium where the pride of New York was taking on the Cleveland Indians. The economy was in a shambles after the US mortgage crisis had rocked the global financial system, and many Wall Streeters were desperate for distractions. But the balding former bond trader was not there to watch a game of baseball. What a plot twist! They've hooked me already.
It's such like purple, like flowery narrative language they keep using here. And it's quite frankly waffle when it comes to most of this. Um, he goes into little bits about, the whopping 5.9 trillion in assets, blah 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 blah. Just the shattering numbers of
Hmm.
modern BlackRock. The best thing actually about this article, before we get into some of the history stuff, because really this article only starts like halfway down.
Yeah.
A lot of this is waffle and preamble and trying to get people who are not yet aware of what BlackRock is up to speed.
Hmm.
I think everyone here, because our previous teams, knows who Larry Fink is. They know who BlackRock is. They know their current state. It's really how they got there, and they gloss over a lot of the financial crisis stuff in this. To be honest,
Yeah.
they don't
Oh
talk
yeah,
about really
here's your
how the
favorite
sausage
bit
got
where
made.
he's Fink tells me instead he went to First Boston after failing his final interview for Goldman Sachs. He's placed in his bond trading department and given his real estate knowledge is mainly trading mortgage-backed bonds. Blah blah blah. He built a close-knit, hard-working, and ferocious loyal unit around him. Many of his team were Jewish, leading some the firm to dub Fink's desk Little Israel.
There's some great bits after that.
He
Um,
recalls his manager telling him to hire a wop to work on the desk when everyone else was off for the Jewish holidays.
Hey Larry, I know you got your little Israel team there, but every time it's Shabbat, there's nobody watching the Asian markets. Can you hire us a wop,
Yeah, this
please?
gets even better. This turned out to be a working class Wharton graduate from Monticello named Robert Capito. But when Rosh Hashanah arrived, it emerged that Capito was just as Jewish as the rest of the desk.
Uh, Good lord, good lord. Despite the awful casual xenophobia video, oh come on, how can you not love the Go Hire a Warp line? That's very Sopranos pilled. Um, they hired me on as a token warp. No, it goes into a lot of that, but they basically talk about those of you who don't know who Fink is, early life, ha ha ha. He was born in the Valley in California, basically. It tries to make him sound working class, but he's not. His dad owned a large shoe
Yeah,
store, and his mom was a professor at a university, like what was it? One of the California universities. She was an English professor, so he was like upper technocrat class when he was born, and he kind of just bummed around for a bit. He's not someone who is particularly exceptional. He doesn't come from a good educational background. He is just, and I mean this not in the way you think I do. He's part of a strata of society who isn't allowed to fail.
yeah. No, it is very much we are going to spend $1 million sending you to various different colleges because then we're going to hold that over you for the rest of your
Yeah.
life if you fail.
He bummed around, UCLA. He talks about how he didn't know what his major was. He's one of those, typical rich kids, doesn't know what he's doing, fails upwards kind of
Can
guy.
we continue with the FT one? They're starting to get into the bit here. He's becomes friends with Ralph Schlossstein
Well,
of
we'll talk about Fink was most famous before Blackrock for being a massive failure.
yes,
Um,
I did briefly skip over that actually when I was scrolling through here.
at first, Boston, he was responsible for
Yeah,
wrongly predicting an interest rate hike when there was actually an interest rate.
they
Sorry,
fell.
the interest rate fell, and he lost 100 million in like a week, basically. And he was very, very publicly, it's difficult to fire people in the finance industry because of the way teams work and things like that, especially at that stage. But he was very, very publicly made persona non grata in the finance industry
Mm,
after making that terrible, terrible bet. There's also a very, very interesting thing later on. At first, Boston, he was actually responsible in that team for creating mortgage-backed securities. Like
yes.
Larry Fink is like the guy really behind mortgage-backed securities, behind like the subprime mortgage bundles that create the financial crisis. And as some of this goes on, they talk about how he wasn't, directly involved, and that's why he was given all these Federal Reserve contracts and stuff. It's he's very much part of the tapestry of how the system was set up. Especially when you get into some of his Blackstone stuff, and then we start talking about Aladdin, which is their kind of prediction software.
Yeah, well,
It's
the way of looking at it in the same way of trying to discuss, like U.S. government logistics in the 70s and 80s without mentioning IBM and Microsoft and Gates and characters like that who ended up playing a kind of fundamental role in setting up things for the next sort of era because they developed or repackaged one small element of one thing which the entire system became dependent on. And in the same sense here, so much became dependent on all the quote, quote opportunities that were opened up by what would you refer to as residential mortgage-backed securities or the first, property ETFs and things like that, which, as you said earlier on, Fink was part of the whole forefront of designing these sort of financial media, as it were.
We'll go into that. The Vanity Fair article has a bit about how he developed that in it as well. I just want to go over the bits that the FT article has in it because the rest of it isn't particularly useful. And I will say that the Vanity Fair is better in certain areas, but we need to kind of pick what we're going on here because a lot of it bleeds into each other, and I want to kind of segment this so it's much more understandable. How Blackrock comes about is he runs into someone he kind of is acquainted with called Ralph Schlossenstein, who's a former Carter administration finance guy. I think he worked for the Treasury during the Carter administration. And he pitches the idea of kind of the bond and securitization financial management business that BlackRock would become. He's able to do this through a small loan of $5 million from Blackstone Financial Management. There again, we'll go into that in a little bit more detail when we get to the Vanity Fair article. Blackstone Financial Management, which is part of a division of Blackstone, they enjoy a strong start. To quote the FT article, thanks to the gold-plated connections and the pedigree of Fink and his team. Make of that what you will. From the earlier articles about the early comments about Little Israel and all the former administration people who were involved.
Mm.
Yeah, JD says I can't believe we're ruled by a Cali surfer, bro. Not really. I don't think
Mm.
people of
But
that tribe are particularly good at surfing.
this
But
basically boils down to yeah, they've got all these different native Barbara. You've got Capito, Novik, Golub, Keith Anderson, Sherson Lemon. These are and Susan Wagner, Hugh Frater. All these people are basically what comes together to form Blackrock. And
yes,
then he just gets in touch as you do when you're sitting at your desk at your job. You're like, oh yeah, I can phone up the guys at Lehman Brothers. They're cool, and I'll just borrow $5 million, And
Yep.
then I don't know if it's here or elsewhere, where yeah, like it's like, oh yeah, he casually gets bankrolled it with $5 million loan in return for a 50% stake, and then in 6 years later they were worth $23 billion.
Just like that.
That's one hell of a return on investment.
It glosses over how that happens. Yeah, Blackstone is very similar.
Well,
There's a bit about it later that
yeah,
BlackRock's name is kind of a nod to Blackstone,
no,
that
I
they had
think
that
it's
blessing to do
in the
that.
Vanity Fair article where
Yeah.
he's joking to Robert Capito about how he was going to name it Black Pebble or something.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I don't know. It should be called Black Pill at this point.
Which is totally an indication that they know, like Black Pebble is a subsidiary of Blackstone.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Which is kind of funny. But yeah, it is really a nod towards their parent company.
God.
But
JD in chat, Nancy Pelosi is the greatest trader in human history, second only to cooking great Martha Stewart.
oh, Martha Stewart. Martha Stewart's financial management. What a topic that is. God. She bought the Ford family's old house. At one point.
Nothing to see there.
Nothing to see there. Um, but the Vanity Fair article is a little bit better. I just wanted to
Yeah,
go
I'll
into
click over that just
the
now.
FT article had those nice little bits because they're the ones who mentioned Little Israel. But really, the backbone of what we're going to be talking about in the first two acts, as it were, and part of the third is really this Vanity Fair article, which is a gold mine.
Yeah, no,
I've actually put it in the chat
I
here
was
if people
about
want
to
to
do
read
the
along.
same, but yes, I would recommend everyone takes the 10-15 minutes because it's quite a long article. There's a lot of stuff in here, and it's
Yes.
not like it's all based, but a lot of the stuff that who's written this, they're probably dead now anyway. They've probably been killed. Susanna Andrews and Nigel Parry. I bet Nigel Parry wrote all of it. There is stuff in here that I just, if you were to talk about Blackrock and the way that they have in here, conspiracy theory, it's anti-Semitic, it's this, that, and the next thing, to assume that they're all working together, a bit. But there's like a number of sources they draw on here directly from the people working in these institutions. We're like, yeah, it's all really pally, we're all Jewish, no one really cares.
There's a lot of stuff in here. I'll just go over the preamble because it's even in 2010. The article is called Larry Fink's $12 trillion shadow, as we said earlier. Although few Americans know his name, they didn't at this point, especially in 2010. Larry Fink may be the most powerful man in the post-bailout economy. His giant BlackRock money management firm controls and monitors more than $12 million worldwide, including the balance sheets of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Let's not forget that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac were quasi-governmental organizations, and the toxic AIG and Bear Stearns assets taken over by the US government last year. How did Fink rebound from a humiliating failure to become the financial fulcrum of Washington and Wall Street? It's something that is not explicit in articles past this point, that BlackRock is very much brokered into this powerful position by the US government.
Yes.
There's a bit of fluff to start with this, but really,
I love the fluff though. This one's not as good as one of the ones we're gonna get into later, which is actually, it's so fluff, it's amazing.
yes.
Yeah,
I don't want to.
They do. I do like the fact in here to talk about, yet among the men who run Wall Street, it would be hard to find anyone who's not at least a little bit in awe of Larry Fink. Well, some, especially those who have known him the longest, snicker privately about how clearly the 57-year-old seems to relish his transformation in the last year and a half into a Wall Street statesman, its top consigliere.
Consigliere, yes.
And the leading member of the country's financial oligarchy. There is nothing but admiration for the vast power of BlackRock. When was the last time they used the term financial oligarchy to talk about people who were actually financial oligarchs? I mean, the only place you'll find writing like this nowadays is in like the Socialist Worker or some crap like that, where they're, it's actually quite funny to watch them log and discuss in depth their effective like strikes against Amazon and stuff like that. But that's something possibly for a different stream.
The term oligarchy has been almost completely sectioned off for use with the term Russia.
Yeah.
Oligarchs are what other countries have.
Well, no, oligarchs come from Russia.
Yes. Oligarchs are what Russia has. It's not something America has. America doesn't have oligarchs. It's a word that's really, outside of things like the socialist work, which really left the lexicon, and it really shouldn't. It's very, very apt when it comes to Larry Fink. It goes on to talk about 13.5 billion acquisition of Barclays Global Investors, which was a huge acquisition. If you want to quickly switch back to the FT article, there's a graph in there which should quite neatly illustrate
Is
like
this
the X.
towards the top? Is this the
It's
rise of
it's
Blackrock one?
yes, it is. It's the rise of BlackRock one.
Yeah, no,
You,
I can see what you mean here. There was just this almost exponential path of growth, especially from like 2010 onwards. How
Yeah,
curious.
look at that jump. You see pre-financial crisis, it's quite big. It's taken, it's bought up Merrill Lynch investment managers. It manages a lot of money, but it triples in size post 2008. In fact, in 2009, it is bigger than the entire hedge fund industry combined with the private equity and venture capital industry, which is mind-boggling when you think of that. That it's bigger than two other industries combined, and it's
Yes.
only getting bigger, and it's stayed that way. It's stayed about equivalent to the entire size of the rest of the market for the entirety of the rest of its existence with
Well,
its
you're
money
you're
management.
looking at from 2005 to like 2020. What's that there? Maybe a third of a trillion, quarter of a trillion,
Yeah,
and then all of a sudden
it's
it's
still
it's
significant,
it's
but
12, 16 times its size, 15 years later. Is there anything out there that has grown like that as a financial entity at all? Is there anything that compares to that? I mean, that's even like that, maybe not the same total size and market cap, but I don't even think Amazon grew that quickly.
I want to read. I want to read a lot of this verbatim because it's
Hmm.
so narrative and there's so.
Any specific bits you want to go from?
Oh, I mean the Vanity Fair article. I'm going to read from the paragraph after the one we just started with. So the one that starts with BlackRock's vast reach.
Oh, I'm already there.
Yeah. BlackRock's vast reach in the global markets is not, however, its only source of influence these days. That Fink pulled off the Barclays deal in the aftermath of the 2008 financial meltdown is, in itself, impressive, but he did more than merely survive the wreckage unscathed. Indeed, it's hard to argue that anyone or any firm on Wall Street gained as much stature from the economic crisis as did Fink and BlackRock. It's very who benefits.
Yeah.
And again, they only were able to pull off these deals because of the blessing and privileged position they
So I
got from
might
the US government.
I might before we continue on just get up the second title card because I think that's such an appropriate line to feed into it.
Yes. We are still going over some of the history here, but yes. Act 2. Have you ever driven past a fire and wondered, how could this benefit me? That's essentially, again, with massive assistance from the US government, what BlackRock did. BlackRock's entire business model is really predicated on human misery. It is predicated on capitalizing on financial failure and doing so through the strong arm and the preferential treatment of the Federal Reserve System and the U.S. government. Um, sorry. At the height of the disaster, when the American economy was on the brink, it was Fink that the Wall Street CEOs, including J.P. Morgan Chase's Jamie Dimon, Morgan Stanley's John Mack, and AIG's Robert Wulmstad turned to for help and counsel, as did the US Treasury and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, whose top officials turned to Fink for advice on the financial markets and assistance on the 30 billion financing of the sale of Bear Stearns to JP Morgan and the 180 billion bailout of AIG, the 45 billion rescue of Citigroup, and those of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac at 112 billion and growing. Again, they're not turning to BlackRock because BlackRock has all this liquidity. They don't. They just handle other people's money. They're turning to them to handle public money. 30 billion, 45 billion, 112 billion. This is all public money, and these are all public contracts that um, it goes on, I think, a little bit later to actually talk about the
Well,
the
just
fact that it's
to
not the profit here. that BlackRock's looking for. It is the prestige, the connections, and just the sheer size that they gain from handling all this.
Also, as we'll find out that previously to this, or around the same period, BlackRock set around acquiring large amounts of mortgage-backed securities as well. And a lot of their funds, because they are funds in the construction industry, they are in the energy industry, they are in the basic resources sort of industry, or your raw resources, whatever you would call them. If they were to bet on all these things, given the fact that they had already set the new value for all the financial instruments around the housing market, that might give them some kind of tactical advantage, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
I do find this interesting as well, though. I mean, I don't quite remember 2008 as vividly as possibly other people, because I was 8 years old and my life wasn't greatly affected by it at the time. But today, through an array of government contracts, BlackRock has effectively become the leading manager of Washington's bailout of Wall Street. So when Ben Bernanke's doing the whole Wall Street needs another $500 billion or the global economy is going to collapse, and they had all these conferences about it, did they ever publicly mention BlackRock in the media?
No.
I don't
BlackRock
think
was not
so,
in the conversation really at this time. I mean,
because
for Larry Fink to suddenly get this amount of influence almost out of nowhere, like
yeah.
how many, like the sheer magnitude of kids he must have had to have touched is just mind-boggling. But
Oh, he was at all the Epstein parties.
dear, yeah, it it really is.
God. If Larry
God,
Fink is currently at the hub of the wheel of American capitalism, as his friend Ken Ligon, the founder of Home Depot and a former director of the New York Stock Exchange, puts it, he has achieved this position largely in the shadows. Hmm. Yeah, there you go. They even say that here. Skipped this bit over, but I should come back over it. The firm oversees 130 billion of toxic assets the U.S. government took on as part of the Bear and Stearns sale. Rescue of AIG also monitors the balance sheets, which puts together some 5 trillion. That built up quickly then to 130 billion. AIG, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac, 5 trillion,
well,
and provides
the issue,
daily risk evaluations to the New York Fed on the 1.2 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities it has purchased in an effort to jumpstart the country's housing market. Uh,
talks about his gold-plated Rolodex, blah 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 blah.
I think this is the second article they talk about his gold-plated Rolodex. I think they
Yeah,
do
they
that in
do.
the
Oy vey.
Financial Times one as well.
Yeah, there's a bit here. Again, this article it would almost be reactionary today. BlackRock's enormous and growing influence and its sheer size, too big to fail, some say, has begun to raise questions. It's like Blackwater. It's like the Blackwater of finance, almost a shadow government, says one senior bank executive, referring to the mountain of government contracts awarded to the firm. Although others, including the massive California-based Pacific Investment Management Company, have benefited from the gravy train of post-bailout government jobs, none appears to have gained nearly as much as BlackRock. Fink's firm has been granted a privileged view into a broad swathe of financial markets, raising questions, says James Bianco, the CEO of Bianco Research. And it's amazing that from here on out, BlackRock only seems to pick winners apart from a very, very public disaster with selling people a building that was worth nothing. And they do so because they're able to manipulate the market by being so big that they
Well,
set
yeah,
the market.
it's the swamp. BlackRock, Federal Reserve, Blackwater, all these different entities. This is the swamp. That's what I meant earlier on by like Blackwater as your essentially sort of domestic economic hitman outfit for the Federal Reserve and other
Well,
big
again,
banks.
it led to questions about Fink's long-standing relationship with senior government officials, particularly Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson and Gethner, his successor. So he knows the current and former Treasury Secretary.
Hmm.
That's really how it worked. It really is just jobs for your friends. Where is it? Fink, blue 10 billion assets. I'm trying to find the bits right because This is a lot of it's fluff here.
Yeah.
But risky business. Here we go. During the next decade, that bit.
During the next.
It's the second. It's the second in the risky business bit.
Risky business. Yes, during the next decade.
During the next decade, Fink would become something of a legend on Wall Street. Along with Lou Reiner of Salomon Brothers, he would be credited for developing the multi-trillion-dollar debt securitization market that has transformed the face of finance. So it's not just mortgage-backed securities. He's responsible, at least in part, for the entirety of the debt securitization industry. I was going to briefly describe that. But I'm also going to briefly describe in a little bit BlackRock's biggest trick and main asset. So I don't want to get too much into technical stuff. But basically, what happens is securitized debt. When you buy a car loan or a mortgage, there is a security that is sold on that mortgage, and that's the only way that debt gets distributed now. Banks
Yes.
don't have a balance sheet in which they have assets and debt. What happens is that debt immediately goes off their balance sheets and is put into a market, a securities market, which means it's basically it's a literal shell game.
It's IOU contracts on somebody else's debt because it makes it in theory worth more to hold it as opposed to just holding debt that people would pay interest on.
You're also allowed to say it's lower risk by doing that as well.
Yes.
Because the logic of the Federal Reserve is people don't default on bonds and securities. People default on loans, but people don't default on bonds and securities. So if you back that loan by a bond or security, just by the fact of it being backed by a bond or security, it becomes quote unquote safer, ignoring completely kind of the balance of the loan.
What you do is you take all those different bonded securities that were a low level and you stick them all into one, big security that you sell as a package now that you've bought all the other securities that are inside it from other people, and then you sell that onto one of the other big investment banks, and then they proceed to take that one, group that up with other groups, and then it's the whole nonsense that's in I can't remember the name of it now. The Big Short. Yes.
By 2008, this market of mortgages and car and credit card loans, purchased from banks, sliced into pieces, repackaged, and sold to thousands of investors, would help bring the economy to its knees. But long before it spiraled out of control, it was considered an incredible innovation. Looking back, Fink says we were able to narrow the cost of housing in America, which isn't true. They basically created a massive false market.
See, there's also a bit of a sort of sleight of hand here as well with it, and sold to thousands of investors. No, they're packaged up and then sold to funds that are part of an index that an investor, quote unquote, an investor has as part of like their pension fund or
no
an
individual
ISA or like a basic portfolio or something. It's not like, that this idea that you would go to like the New York Stock Exchange, like, hello, can I buy $1 million in debt securitized in the mortgage market? You would just get laughed off. Because obviously, further in The Big Short, if you actually want to play in this market, you need to be one of these like multi-billion-dollar organizations. As we saw earlier on, you have to have this somehow miracle growth from $5 million to $20 billion in the space of 6 years to sit at this card table, as it were.
Well, it's the whole thing about, we talked about the Bush's various different housing acts, and the housing acts really since Reagan, and as it very much accelerated under Clinton, there was this administration effort to create this. And he goes on to say, he recalled how rewarding it felt going to Washington to talk with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, again, quasi-governmental organizations that they ended up essentially monitoring and default managing. Even in my 20s, I felt there was an enormity to what we were doing to help. Basically, what they were doing is creating unfeasibly cheap credit to debt-trap poor people into homes they couldn't afford. And that's what caused the financial crisis.
Yeah, no, the next bit here. Yet, Fink identifies most with the statesman-like aspects of his work. His Wall Street peers remember another side to him. People liked him, but he was also perceived as cocky and rough-hewn. This guy who always wanted more than he had. It says one former first Boston partner, he had his nose pressed to the window. I'm sure he didn't steam up the glass though. You could see this this intense ambition.
Well, it's the whole thing where he talks about
I'm glad I got away with
Schlossenstein.
that one there.
Yes, very good. It's like the bit in the FT article where it talks about Schlossenstein, and he basically just says they had a lot in common. Both were Democrats. Schlossenstein had been a Treasury official in the Carter administration.
Mm.
That's just glossed over. Just like, oh yeah, but both these people like Democrat political insiders, and this guy was, a Treasury official in the Carter administration,
Yeah,
and now
it's
he's
God. There's
setting
even
up
more
a.
this year. His worst
Yep.
moments, he's remembered as a big swinging dick. The term immortalized in Michael Lewis's Liar's Poker, used to describe the most arrogant and aggressive of Wall Street bond traders. Over the years, Fink has responded bitterly to this characterization, blaming it on the snobbery of Wall Street's WASP investment bankers who look down on the
Yoing.
Jewish and Italian traders who are allowed to succeed in the mortgage bond business only, he says, because we weren't really wanted anywhere else. But neither view is quite accurate. He was considered the canny master of the market, and his interest in policy and strategy gave him more intellectual heft than many of his peers.
Is he really saying that investment bankers aren't Jewish? Because that's it might be a slight, there might be a slight difference there, but it's anyway. That's a very bold claim to say the investment banks are in some way anti-Jewish. That's kind of hilarious. But anyway, yeah, he talks about adding blah blah blah. This is again, this bit here is the history we went through previously.
Yeah.
A lot of this. Yeah, he talks about the humiliating flame
Oh.
out.
Do we
Where
do
the,
we want to get into the Aladdin section, or will I leave that before whilst we do some other stuff? And
we'll leave that for a little bit. What I want to get into now really is I'd like to talk about um a little bit of how BlackRock is able to manage all this money without technically owning anything.
is this for the CNBC link here?
Yes, I'd like to quickly go into what an exchange traded fund is, because it's going to become very, very important later on. Because through all of this, what you have is BlackRock, they're able to avoid a lot of the antitrust stuff because they don't technically own a lot of these assets. There's a fact check later down we'll go into from Reuters, trying to talk about conspiracy theories about how BlackRock doesn't actually own all these companies, they just run them. It's just like, well, it's very managerialism. It's very, we don't own the roads, we just administer all of them, We don't own the public assets, we're just the managers of them. It's peak managerialism in action, and I need to just get through some of the slightly more boring financial stuff here. The biggest outside of all the government contracts and essentially being, a federal government institution, BlackRock's biggest trick is the fact that they use exchange traded funds. What an exchange traded fund is, in a very, very simple way, is instead of you going to a stockbroker, him buying you individual stocks and getting a percentage of the profits from that, an exchange traded fund is a financial instrument in which they basically create the credit default swaps we talked about. It is the securitization of stocks and bonds further. It is the securitization of securities in some ways. It's like
Mm.
it's like exponential.
Yeah,
What they
so
do is
that's what I meant with the, once you've packaged the debt up with a security, you then take all the securities and put them together, and that's seen technically as a, as you said earlier on, because you're culminating all of these things, you're supposedly spreading the risk. And this is the
well,
whole issue with it, is that they focus on one element, which is the rating, and not actually the rating of the crap that's in the whole thing. Because that's, again, we keep coming back to the film, but it is very relevant. That's what happens at the start of The Big Short. Michael Burry starts picking apart the information of, what's actually inside all these collateralized debt obligations for these massive banks that are making a killing in the mortgage market. And he's like, oh, well, these people are making more money than they were a few years ago. And he asks, someone in his office to get him that information. He's like, well, what do you want that information for? No one reads it.
Well, it's the same thing. No one really knows what's in a lot of these ETFs.
Mm.
Again, what Rob mentioned in the chat is what we talked about a few weeks ago when we talked about the green capital stuff and we talked about BlackRock then, is that they're able to vote on shareholders' behalf. It's considered
Yeah.
a passive fund, therefore the fees are lower. It's able to basically mostly be automated in terms of its management. We'll get onto how later. We will talk about Aladdin.
Well, yeah,
But
they've got the brief bit here. ETFs, like most investment funds, including traditional index funds and actively managed funds, are a basket of securities that trade on an exchange and can contain securities like stocks, bonds, and commodities. Investment funds like ETFs are considered a lower risk investment because of the increased, diversification over single stock investing. By holding multiple stocks or other securities, some also offer full transparency by publishing their holdings each day. This differs from traditional mutual funds that do not disclose their holdings daily, giving ETF investors more ability to see what is quote unquote under the hood, which is like a sort of bait and switch. Because
no one ever does it.
the
Yeah.
transparency you're seeing is what you think is this, like, this daily evaluation, this daily, update of the performance of your ETF is actually just BlackRock's algorithm computer spitting out a number that it thinks is right based on conditions that have absolutely nothing to do with the value of the things inside the ETF themselves.
Yeah.
And this is the reason why things like, I remember getting into some of Peter Schiff's stuff early on, and he always used to talk about how, the difference between the gold market and the gold ETF market, and how the two were basically completely uncorrelated at times.
Yes.
But anyway, we shall continue on.
It's because these aren't bonds, these aren't securities, these aren't anything like that. They're not stocks. They are financial instruments. Again, they're like the credit default swaps, in that the contents of them can and are quite often it's the idea that they are greater than the sum of their parts, which they aren't.
Yeah.
They financially cannot be, and it's this idea that through chopping up low grade stocks and debt, you're able to get mid and high grade stocks and debt. It's the same way of doing it, really. Nobody actually looks what's in the ETF fund. Most investors don't actually have proper access to that information because it's run on their behalf. They don't. A lot of them don't know they're invested in ETF funds. It's not listed in this article, but I want to go through how you are basically forced into ETF funds because ETF funds are seen as cheaper. Therefore, things like pension funds that have a fiduciary duty to increase, as much as possible with low risk, are forced into investing in ETFs because, in terms of their cost to risk rating, they are one of the only games in town. It's one of the only things that makes sense to invest in on paper. A lot of the rules in risk post 2008 force people into buying these financial instruments because their balance sheet needs to have low risk.
The way you
and it
see
also
it,
means
obviously, the way you see it is that there is it's obviously not a paradox because it makes plenty of sense once you realize what's going on. But when they say diversification, what they actually mean is solidification. Into one
yes,
single entity. You're taking all these dynamic parts of, say, the energy industry and, 4 different oil companies, 5 different natural gas companies, and 3 different coal companies, which you could have in a previous sort of era, maybe not so long ago, have managed a number of investments around that with yourself, but it's so complex nowadays, and there are so many conditions, as we've seen with stuff like the whole bloody GameStop saga and all this kind of stuff. When you try and make money as an individual investor, when you're not operating by the same rules that all the big boys are, you get shut down pretty quickly. And the one of the ways that they've made sure that they don't even have to shut people down anymore is they bring in ETFs, they bring in all the lingo, CDOs, this, that, and the next thing. So there's all this jargon, there's all this specialty knowledge. So instead of you going to the bank, taking money out, and then posting it off to some company and buying 200 shares, you instead go to the bank and get told by some advisory person to lend them your money, and then they'll put it into the right funds because they know, and it'll basically end up in some bloody BlackRock ETF or something like that.
Yes, basically all roads end up leading here, and it becomes a positive cycle because you have all this money invested in these ETFs. As we went through a few weeks ago, BlackRock is able to vote on who makes up the boards of these companies. A lot of these companies will make financial decisions that will benefit BlackRock. So they are able to put people in place through their management who will invest more in their products, but gives them more influence, and they can do all of this very, very legally and very safely under the guise of acting on behalf of the federal government to mitigate risk and bring some of this toxic debt into a state where it is no longer considered toxic.
Someone in the
It
chat is
is,
sort of making the point. I'm beginning to draw a picture of them buying up real estate just for the ability to control the housing market, not to profit off of it. Well, that's the whole loophole.
yeah.
BlackRock doesn't profit, it hands profits to other people, and then they get paid a dividend or a bonus or a performance grading or
Well,
whatever
it's like a
crap you want to call it.
politician. They don't even have to own the
Yes.
property. They just have to manage it. And that is the great trick here, that they are able to become essentially they have none of the risk and all of the power. And that's how exchange traded funds one have become a default for a lot of investors because they don't really have any choice and don't directly manage their own portfolios and are told, their pension, they don't know where their pension goes and things like that. And if they do go to financial advisors, they're told that not having an ETF is stupid, basically.
We'll see
And
someone else in chat there saying, this will go this will go on till the majority of boomers are cashed out. Well, it won't. The problem with the boomers dying is not that their money gets handed over, it's that their debt becomes wiped off. Which is why I think they're so adamant to change up a lot of things to do with mortgage policies. We'll probably see, and that there'll be incentives, maybe even in a short number of years, for you to not write your house into the will, but to write your mortgage debt into your will.
yes. There's a whole section of the Vanity Fair article I'd like to read verbatim again because it is so good.
From which section?
It is the section simply marks the interest of the American taxpayer because we're going to go over the Aladdin stuff in kind of a next segment because
in the interest of the American taxpayer.
this bit is amazing.
Whereabouts is this?
It's called "The Interest of the American Taxpayer." It's a subtitle.
All right.
It's relatively near the bottom.
That'll be why. Yes, there we go. Was it just from the bit it starts 10 months later?
Yes. I just want to read you this whole bit. So 10 months later, on the verge of collapse, Merrill Lynch was sold to Bank of America, and soon after that, Thane was pushed out, the manager. By then, Fink was more powerful than ever. In March 2008, during the frantic weekend where Bear Stearns crumbled, he was on everybody's speed dial. On the Saturday morning that JP Morgan called his top executive into the office to consider buying the moribund investment bank, Jamie Dimon hired BlackRock to value Bear Stearns' asset. That seems like a conflict of interest. The next morning, after Dimon had decided they couldn't buy Bear Stearns
Diamond, I believe.
Diamond, sorry, without government support, Gaithner, I think I'm saying that right, the chairman of the New York Fed, called Fink personally for help in managing the $30 billion of toxic debt assets the Fed had taken over. The work at Bear Stearns was particularly brutal, says Charles Halak, a senior BlackRock executive. People were throwing things, they were angry, they didn't want to help. It was a hostile environment. In June, after a call from Fink, AIG's new CEO, Robert Williamstad, hired BlackRock to evaluate the ailing insurer's $77 billion credit default swap portfolio. It was a job that would lead to others when the market came crashing down 6 weeks later. BlackRock owns no private jets. This is like the private, the flight to Singapore story here. It talks about basically how he was bothered and bothered and bothered by all the people who were basically trying
Well,
to get him to step in.
yeah, I was going to say, this is even a different conversation from the one that's in the other article.
Yeah.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
look at.
When AIG was bailed out by the New York Fed that same week, BlackRock again was brought into the company, this time to evaluate and advise the government on what to do with the $100 billion of AIG assets, including the now infamous credit default swap portfolio that the Fed had taken over. For several months, BlackRock would have two teams working inside AIG, one working for the company's management, the other for the Fed. It was a situation so rife with potential conflicts of interest, says Charles Halag, that for a while neither team was told about the other. Again, that's because they are both managers and valuers. They are valuing the debt that they are managing. It is actually insane. By then, BlackRock had already been hired to monitor the troubled portfolios of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. In December 2008, BlackRock would get yet another contract from the New York Fed, this time valued at $103 billion of Citigroup's loans and securities.
That's 301 billion, mind.
Yes, most of which the US government guaranteed against losses as part of its bailout of the giant bank. So they are basically handling the entire bailout, as we're seeing here.
There's
the waterfall of government contracts attracted attention almost immediately. But when asked by members of Congress to explain what BlackRock was being paid and why it was selected without any competitive bidding, Fed officials, and Geithner in particular, revealed virtually nothing. Geithner said that they had been no time to solicit bids from other companies and that BlackRock was chosen because, in quotes, the interest of the American taxpayer would be served, end quote. That's incredible. And it's not part of the normal history of the financial crisis.
No, not at all.
But
this is something we have to admit, we only really became, we knew there was murmurings about this and we'd looked into bits of this before, but I basically did some keyword magic on Google and it spat out lots of this sort of stuff. And it's once you start, you read the other piece, you read one piece, you see that both of them admit that he's got these links between all these people, and then there's the New York Fed, and then they're the people that invented property-based ETFs, and then, that market collapses, but we'll not blame them for it. We'll actually get the New York Fed to bring those people in, give them quasi-governmental style powers, and reevaluate the whole market.
Well, it's completely corrupt. Geithner is his personal friend. They are scratching each other's backs here, and BlackRock has essentially been given the entire bailout of Wall Street without any competitive process.
I would say there's a New York Times one from 2020. Fed asked for BlackRock's help in an echo of 2008. Now, I think we had a brief look through this. Yeah. There was a lot that is not mentioned in this article that is mentioned in the Vanity Fair one.
Yes, it is, but they're referencing this event here. The Fed BlackRock will advise the Federal Reserve on the purchase of billions of dollars in bonds and securities. The terms of the agreement were not disclosed. Once again, stabilize the bond market, blah 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 blah. But it's a massive conflict of interest because the BlackRock is essentially managing the bond market. They have become valuer.
That's the one from the Financial Times. Under one of the programs that BlackRock will help lead, the Fed can buy ETFs that hold stakes in investment-grade bonds, a type of investment that BlackRock sells. I think when I was looking this up earlier on, it's worth remembering that when it comes to the ETF market, BlackRock have issued 35% of all the ETFs ever sold in America. And then Vanguard, a subsidiary and partner of BlackRock, have sold another.
Vanguard is not a subsidiary of BlackRock.
No, there's not a subsidiary, but they own a large amount of each other's.
Yes, they do.
Sort of wealth, as it were, quote unquote, or equity, and are maybe not subsidiaries, but partners of one another. Vanguard Group, they've issued 28% of the market share of ETFs, which means between the two of them, it's over half. And then they're being brought in by the government to evaluate a market that them and their partner dominates half of. Anyone see the problem with that?
It just glosses over here at the end and says, Mr. Keller said conflict of interest measures would be essential for the Fed's credibility, as BlackRock helped the central bank see the economy through another crisis. Well, how can you mitigate what is a very, very clear conflict of interest? They are very, very clearly being allowed to value not even value and manage, but value, manage, then approve the sale of assets that they themselves have created. They are basically able to print money.
Mm.
It any like a 5-year-old could tell you that this is a conflict of interest situation, but it's not something that we are supposed to have the conversation about, because this happened in 2008 and it's now happening again. And it's being done because that's the only way the sausage can get made. That's the only way they can keep the circus going, is to pretend that BlackRock is this private company, but really it isn't.
It's hilarious here that Todd Rosenbluth, head of ETF and mutual fund research for CFRE, a research firm. I could guess it was a research firm when it said it was mutual fund research. God, they just cannot write anymore, can they? Said BlackRock dominated the market for the kinds of bonds, or the kind of bond ETFs the Fed said it would buy. The firm's flagship corporate bond fund, LQD, is a likely beneficiary of the Fed's planned efforts to stabilize the bond market, he said. BlackRock needs to provide transparency in its due diligence process to alleviate concerns that it's choosing to invest in LQD because they are the asset manager running the Fed's program.
Yep.
There's a transparency. You've just said it there. And the problem is that there doesn't need to be, or shall we say, there can be as much transparency as you want if you're not going to get in trouble, because the government gave you the job in the first place and said, "Don't worry, we won't give you into trouble."
Well, it's an entire case of that. To finish this little bit I wanted to talk about here, and then we can read the end of the article and move on a little bit, because I want to make sure that we're to the end of this section in the next really 15 minutes. And so we can move on to kind of the act 3 of this. Under pressure, the Fed eventually did release BlackRock's contracts, because they are based on an extremely.
Still in
this is the Vanity Fair article.
Yeah.
This is the Vanity Fair article, basically picking up where I left off here.
Remove some of the ones we previously read, so I've got less links. But on you go.
Yes. Because they are based on an extremely complex payment schedule, it's difficult to gauge exactly how much BlackRock is making, but it appears to be in the neighborhood of 200 million for the first 3 years of work on AIG and Bear Stearns portfolios. For 2 months' work on the Citigroup portfolio, the firm made 12 million, according to its contract with the Fed, although BlackRock says it worked for 2 additional months for free. BlackRock does not disclose its fees, the fee it charges to other clients, so it's impossible to know if the US taxpayer is as getting a claim is going to get a discount. But some bankers say the fees are inconsequential. Larry would have taken those contracts for nothing, said one financier. Oh, I bet he did. Financier. Oh no. It's about the brand, the stature, and the new business that flows from that. You can't put a price on how valuable the contracts are, and really you can't put a price on essentially being made a government department.
Pretty much.
I'll gloss over it here. They basically go into the fact that really they try and do a little bit of balance here by saying that BlackRock was seen as not involved directly, even though Fink came up with a lot of this market.
That Larry Fink was in the traffic, that he had long-standing relationships with all the players involved was important, but some say not the key issue. What is more significant, they contend, is the fact that in a crisis in the magnitude of the 2008 meltdown, there were so many players who helped to create the mess, from banks and regulators to mortgage brokers and homeowners, but only a few with the ability to clean it up. The man that you hired to fix the problem was the man that created the entity the problem happened around.
Yep.
I know, I mean, there is some weird stuff when you start looking this up, though. I mean, one of the ones I managed to find is some, like, semi-redacted report direct from the New York Fed about this, like, the advisory service agreement they signed with BlackRock in December 2008. Oh, sorry, it made effective in December 2008 by asking them of a request to manage all the Citigroup money in 23rd November 2008. And there was all sorts of stuff in here, but I'm trying to remember at the bottom. They basically say that, like, well, you can't say to people what's in this stuff that we're given to you to value, but if you make money off it, then we might ask you to, but we also might not. So yeah, just you know keep the lips shut and just value this crap.
Yeah, basically, it was all valued, repackaged, and resold. Essentially, a lot of this debt, really, these mortgages are essentially kind of still out there.
Mm-hmm.
They've been repackaged, refinanced, but a lot of this just kind of sat there until they could launder it into a sellable financial product.
And then people from Bloomberg a decade later went on to write Blackrock's Decade: How the Crash Forged a $6.3 trillion giant.
God damn.
10 years later, its shrewd moves are a masterclass on capitalizing on others' risk.
And
Christ.
there's like a weird like MS Paint drawing here,
Yeah, I don't
which
know
is
what this is about.
bizarre. Like,
Why has it
what
got Peter Griffin's face on it?
Hey, Lois.
Lois, I'm a rock.
I'm a black rock, Lois. Get down from there, Peter.
You white Peter.
No, Peter, you can't be Blackrock. I'm gonna be Blackrock. Oh no. God, this is the simpering version of it.
Yeah,
This is like
this is basically that first. I've forgotten who it was now. This is basically that first FT article we read, but with some of the more questionable stuff taken out by the looks of it. It's got the exact same graph. It's got the exact same story. God, yeah. The company predicts the global market for the funds, or yeah, ETFs. Blah blah blah. Company predicts the global market for the funds will more than double by the end of 2023 to 12 trillion. Of course, they would say that. They're the people that issue them. That's like, oh well, yeah. And so I work in the Coke bottling factory and I produce, Diet Coke. And the government says I can value Diet Coke at whatever I want and they'll make up for whatever losses I have. So I've decided that, yeah, I'm going to make a lot of Diet Coke. I'm going to sell it at a set price and I reckon the market will double in a few years.
this is basically like feigning retardation.
Trying to actually work it into a form of explanation that makes any sense in regards to market transactions, in the way that, like, oh well, you value the £2.50 less than the sandwich you bought for £2.50. Like that simple sort of mutually beneficial exchange market interaction that we are familiar with and deal with has absolutely nothing to do with what's going on here.
Yeah, there's
probably it sounds like a really obvious fact, but sometimes it's not until you start trying to parse out what's really going on here that you begin to realize that it makes absolutely no sense.
Well, if you want to look at a completely opposite tone, look at the contemporary article you linked from Fortune called "Can This Man Save Wall Street?" from 2008.
Oh, I love this. I think this is brilliant. I'm gonna read a good bit of this out here because I just like this is gonna have you on the edge of your seat.
Do zoom in it a bit though, because it was tiny on my screen. So
I'll slide the thing over as well on OBS.
Just give it a quick slide. Yes, gotta do some re-engineering. Swoop. we need the OBS window sliding side effect.
Right, anyway, Blackrock's Larry Fink helped popularize the same mortgage-backed securities that nearly poisoned the banking system. Oh, that's nice to let that one slip in there. Now his firm is making millions cleaning up these toxic assets. At 11 o'clock in the evening on Saturday, September 13th, Larry Fink was about to board a flight from New York to Singapore. The following Monday, he was scheduled to meet with the managers of several Asian sovereign wealth funds. For the head of BlackRock, one of the world's largest asset managers, this trip was a huge opportunity that could mean billions of dollars in new business. Still, he knew that the next 19 hours would be a bad time to be unreachable. Just a few miles west of the airport, bankers and government officials were huddled in the offices of the New York Federal Reserve Bank to hash out the fates of three of the biggest financial institutions on Wall Street, namely Lehman Brothers, AIG, and Merrill Lynch. two of the troubled firms. Lehman Brothers and AIG were BlackRock, BLK Fortune 500 clients. Merrill Lynch was BlackRock's biggest shareholder. Funny they mention that as well. Fink made one final call before boarding. Can I get on this plane? He asked a colleague inside the meetings at the New York Fed. You can go, came the response. At that moment, Fink thought Barclays had agreed to buy Lehman, so he boarded. As Fink took off, he could see through his window the lights of lower Manhattan. He did not know it then, but it would be the last time he would see Wall Street, at least the one he recognized in one piece. When Fink landed in Singapore at 5 a.m. on Monday morning, he checked his BlackBerry and scanned the headlines. Lehman bankrupt, Merrill Lynch bought up by Bank of America, AIG collapsing. I felt like Charlton Heston landing on the planet of the apes, says Fink. My world had transformed. Yeah, it's because you landed in bloody Singapore, mate.
It was Earth all the time. You finally made a monk. I mean, and on Planet of the Apes, Planet of the Apes, the musical, maybe. God, that's such a good side gag. Yeah, the writing is very but this is, I love like the narrative attempts by journalists. It's very 12-year-old trying to sound important.
Oh, I just think it's so funny. I mean, maybe you've got a slightly different. Yeah, no, sorry. Yeah, can this man save Wall Street? He shouldn't be allowed to. No one should be allowed to. It should die a death. But no, it's just the same sort of thing. People talking about how, all these things change. What was going on? AIG, Lehman Brothers, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac had all hired BlackRock over the fact the previous months they just happened to have hired BlackRock before they all went out of business. Nothing to think about there. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson had BlackRock on his shortlist to manage your money, a chunk of the $700 billion bank bailout known as the TARP program. God. If Paulson and Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke had been the public faces of the financial crisis, Fink had been its behind-the-scenes fixer and father confessor. The reason so many CEOs have kept him on speed dial in recent months is simple. No other firm is trusted to pick through the exotic securities infecting bank balances sheet and place an accurate value on them. God, he really is just a hitman, isn't he? He just does the dirty work, the wet work, as it were. At a time when the credit rating agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's have lost face, BlackRock's valuations have become a kind of de facto good housekeeping seal of approval that buyers and sellers of distressed assets trust. I think of it like Ghostbusters. When you have a problem, who are you going to call? BlackRock, says Terence Keeley, a managing director at UBS who worked with BlackRock last spring to dispose a troubled $20 billion portfolio of managed-backed securities. BlackRock unloaded it for $15 billion. I think, as you'll find as we're about to read the next article, it wasn't $15 billion. It was a few squid more than that.
Yeah, that event is actually one of the I think the inspirations behind the film Margin Call.
Yes. Yeah, here we have it here from the Economic Times. Of May 21st, 2008, a handful of months before BlackRock is asked by the US government to reevaluate the mortgage security market, UBS announces sale of subprime debts to BlackRock. Oh, what we don't say. Zurich, Swiss banking giant, said on Wednesday it had disposed of US mortgage-related assets for $15 billion, a price that is 30% below the nominal value to a fund managed by US investment BlackRock. So they bought that stuff at a discount rate, were quote-unquote offloading it, which really means giving it to one of their friends to hold for an intermittent period, and then several months later reevaluating the exact same thing they've bought for God knows how much more,
with the blessing of the American government.
Yeah, because they were managing the people's money, of course.
The people's money, comrade.
Yeah, risk reduction remains a critical part of our ongoing financial restructuring, and this sale is a big step towards further reducing our positions in this asset class. See, again, this is the thing you're told that if you invest in one company, one singular company, that's a risky investment because that company might go down. But if you invest in one company that exists to hold the assets of loads and loads of different companies, then that one company, as we talked before, is somehow now greater than the sum of its parts. And the risk in all the other different sort of companies that are put together, that doesn't really matter. These all supposedly come out in the wash anyway. And then, of course, you would never even have to consider the fact that BlackRock, for some form of paper mismanagement, might run out of money. That, of course, isn't going to happen because they're
No,
because they're so clever, and Larry Fink's a financial genius.
as all of these like try and stress that it's not that he was handed this all on a silver platter, and he basically knew what the market was going to do, so invented products that are the default option for the market that he knew was coming. That he knows all these treasury secretaries, and he's just handed trillions of dollars of government money
But yes,
to.
someone in the chat, ESG scores and captive press allow even more leeway in arbitrary valuations. Oh, entirely.
Yes.
But it's worthwhile to see that this just didn't start with ESG scores, 5-6 years ago. That depending on how you really want to look at a lot of financial policy, this has been going on continuously. And one way or another, there has always been some mechanism by which a private entity is used to create sort of a consolidation in the power elite, be that either financially or politically or both, by whatever mechanism works. So if it's revaluing stuff after the housing market, then that's the tact. If it's a case of forcing ESG scores on companies for compliance, then that's the tact. It's whatever it requires to hold power.
Yes. I would now like to. I don't know. Is there anything we need to discuss anymore from this section here?
No, because we've got this UBS thing now is roughly redundant because all we needed really was the punchline anyway.
Yes.
We have done the UBS one, so we can get rid of that, I believe. Should we get back onto their Aladdin software then from the Vanity Fair article?
We can do. I think we are now though moving into Act 3, which I haven't done the image for.
I'm going to simulate the image anyway. Think of, they've got this financial sort of machine called Aladdin. Basically, think of it as like a HAL, but done up as like a money grubbing Moroccan sort of market kind of guy trying to haggle with you for some sort of fake bloody football shirt or something, or like a fake Armani watch. That is
Okay.
Aladdin.
I was trying to, sorry, I've been trying to find an image that I really want to use, which is like the massive computer mess from Serial Experiments Lane, but none of the images I could find were high res enough.
That or
So
the computer out of the Aronofsky film Pi would also suffice.
yes, basically it's a giant mesh
That's
of
actually that's actually a lot
wires,
more relevant to the subject of conversation given that film.
or you to the
Jews, number
yes
magic, usual
number
stuff.
mesh. Numerology. They're basically, I don't know, how do you start explaining Aladdin to people without boring the hell out of them? Because it's quite a specific thing. Like people in the financial industry understand what these programs are inherently, but it's quite difficult to explain just the as the economist says, like the monolithic power of something like Aladdin. I think we might have to go back to the Vanity Fair article actually.
I'm already there, however, I'm going to quickly get an image first up for Pi appreciators in the chat. Rule number
Yes.
2: everything can be represented and understood through numbers. weird noise, drum and bass, black and white,
Yes.
seizure aesthetic. Yeah, fucking love that.
I'm actually going to finish this stream by reading the last two articles of this Vanity Fair article because they are amazing. But I'm not, I'm not. I that's just it's just the perfect closer. And in the context of 2022 and not 2010, they will actually make you mad. They will make you so angry. But they are actually great. Again, this feels, in retrospect, almost reactionary. You couldn't write this now and not be seen as being on the right.
So, tell you what, shall we start with the first couple of paragraphs here, and then we'll get into the other two articles here, which are kind of they almost deal with it again, and as you said, like like a bizarrely like posing sort of way, which you normally don't see with this kind of stuff, at least not anymore.
No.
Yeah, in 1988, with several partners, including Ralph Schlossstein, a Lehman Brothers banker and former Carter $5 million line of credit, more than $20 million in management by 1993, continues on, same story. During the next 15 years, Blackrock would grow at a staggering rate. You don't say. They go public in 1999,
Yeah, the bit I want to start reading from is, but while its size was impressive, what would distinguish Blackrock was its state-of-the-art system for evaluating and managing risk, with 5,000 computers running 24 hours a day, overseen by a team of engineers, mathematicians, analysts, and programmers. Blackrock's computer farm could monitor millions of daily trades and scrutinize every single security in its clients' investment portfolios to see how they would be affected by even the most minor change in the economy. Again, it's very, very TED. Churning through 200 million calculations each week, its computer could simulate every imaginable shift in interest rates, every conceivable change in the financial markets, and stress test the performance of hundreds of thousands of securities in numerous global crisis scenarios. Let's not forget that this is the system that led to the mortgage-backed security being declared safe, because the computer said it was safe. The Aladdin system is one of the things that allowed this whole house of cards to be built. Anyway, known as Aladdin, the system was effectively a multi-billion-dollar computerized worrywart, searching the markets for anything that could go wrong. And it would become the foundation of a second business that would expand BlackRock's reach beyond asset management and into the business of advising clients for whom things had gone wrong. Officially formed 2000, the BlackRock Solutions division now has over 140 clients, the best known of which happens to be the US government. We're talking about just financial big data here. With Aladdin, BlackRock Solutions, 600 employees can evaluate a client's holdings in a day, grinding through a 30 billion portfolio, as did with Bear Stearns in March 2008. I want to go on a spiel about how computer systems aren't.
We'll see. I think maybe neutral, I can do this in a simpler way. If people are familiar with the idea of a homo economicus, as we talked about it in the Keynesianism special, and if you haven't seen that, go back, because it will probably make you understand some of the things we're talking about here better. It was the general notion that the classical economists thought of man as this very simple algorithmic entity who bought low, sold high, buy low, sell high, whereas that's not really how it works. People evaluate things subjectively. Sometimes they buy at one price and they sell at the same price again because they just want money to spend on something else. Sometimes they lose money because they get a psychic profit of holding whatever it is over a certain time. Sometimes they make money on assets they didn't otherwise think they would. And a whole number of different situations can arise. And it is ultimately the fact that each and every individual person, as Carl Menger would say, is the beginning and the end of all economic activity. It is the choices they make. And that is how the stock market used to work. Is that even people who were investors and entrepreneurs in a very small sphere, still made decisions every day, every week, every month about different contracts, futures, or different assets, or different shares and stocks. And they put money towards them, they took money out of them, and this meant that you ended up with calculation in the market, as Mises would describe it, and that's how you got share values. However, if you're someone that wants to rig the game, it becomes really difficult to rig the game and understand how it works when the end all and be all of explaining to someone how it works is, well, people just make decisions. That doesn't suit if you're a power-hungry nutter wanting to run the world like some sort of Bond villain. So instead, what you do is you create a machine that does buy low, sell high, and the Homo economicus kind of model, and does that repeatedly and does it predictably, so that you can then make transactions around this sort of thing that's operating like a computer, and that then everyone else that's involved in the same markets that you're involved in now has to act like a computer to keep up with your computer, because there is this sort of perceived mythos that computers make better decisions than people, even though computers can only make decisions people have told them to make anyway, which is a whole other conversation. But it basically means
Yes.
you have this whole big sort of process that used to be organic transactions between people that really made the values up, to values being decided by a computer basically flicking about ones and zeros and going buy low, sell high. There is no,
Well,
the idea of value investment, that you're investing in a stock
it's
because there is some reason to do so, comes completely sort of dissociated from the equation.
it's not just that BlackRock was in charge of valuing all these troubled firms. Through Aladdin, BlackRock, and as we'll see through its spread and its ubiquity, became the default arbiter of the logic behind what is and isn't a risk.
Yes.
And the first article I want to read from is from the Financial Times. It's called BlackRock's Black Box, the technology hub of modern finance. Um,
Yeah, I'll just. Do you want me to just start from the start here, or is there a specific bit you
I, I,
want to
no,
get through?
I can read this. Used by rival fund managers, the reach of the Aladdin platform raises possible conflicts of interest. You don't say. I like that. Again, this article's from 2020, I believe. But it actually goes into some of the stuff that we talked about previously that's very rarely seen. So it says, as toxic mortgage-backed securities tore through the financial system more than a decade ago, the US government turned to Larry Fink, one of their earliest pioneers, as we keep hearing, for help. Mr. Fink made a fortune packing mortgages together and selling off slices of the combined pools in the 1980s before founding BlackRock, which today stands as the world's largest asset manager. As the crisis deepened, Mr. Fink spoke to Hank Paulson, US Treasury Secretary, more often than some chief executives of the big Wall Street banks, in brief, urgent calls. He offered the Treasury and Federal Reserve a powerful tool to gauge risk um, in the assets at the center of the havoc. The arrangement would net BlackRock tens of millions of dollars in government contracts awarded largely without a tender process, putting it at the forefront of the fintech revolution,
Ugh.
and cement Mr. Fink's standing at the intersection of politics and finance. At the heart of this exchange was Aladdin, BlackRock's vast technology platform. The system linked investors to markets, ensures portfolios hold the right assets, and measure risk in the world's stocks, bonds, and derivatives, currencies, and private equity. Aladdin's influence has surged since the financial crisis. Today, it acts as the central nervous system as many of the largest players in the investment management industry, and as Financial Times discovered, for several huge non-financial companies. Vanguard and State Street Global Advisors, the largest fund managers after BlackRock, are users, as are half of the top 10 insurers by assets, as well
Uh,
as Japan's
I will
1.
just add, if you add State Street Global Advisors onto BlackRock and Vanguard, as discussed before, you then make up 67%, I believe it is, of the entire ETF market share.
Yes, you also make up probably the same percentage of voting rights in corporations as well. It's in those firms combined are enough to wipe the boards of most major American companies if they were to in some way collude, or if their computer programs were in some way to tell them to all do the same thing through some miracle. Apple, Microsoft, and Google's parent firm Alphabet, the three biggest US public companies, all rely on the system to steward hundreds of billions of dollars in their corporate treasury investment portfolios. Yet the true reach of Aladdin is unknown outside of BlackRock. The New York-based managers last revealed exactly how much of the world's assets sit in the system in February 2017, when they reached 20 trillion. BlackRock told the FT that total assets didn't reflect how clients use the system. One former employee says the figure is no longer disclosed because of the negative attention the enormous sum attracts. You don't say. In the past 3 years, Aladdin has added scores of new clients. The stock market has gained a third in value, and the bond market is 13% larger, basically bubble. So it's probably maybe close to 30 billion.
Well, they go on to say here today, 21.6 trillion sits on the platform from just a third of its 240 clients.
Oh dear.
According to the public documents verified with the companies and first-hand accounts, that figure alone is equivalent to 10% of the world's stocks and bonds. I think when I was going to say when I last looked, I think it's 13% of all the stocks and bonds in the world is either overseen, traded, or valued by this Aladdin program.
And that's
Aladdin
just
has
a third.
become a mainstay of the marketplace. Peter Krause, chief executive of Aperture Investors and former head of Alliance Bernstein, the $600 billion investment group. It has a huge historic client base. Aladdin has fueled BlackRock's all-conquering rise by tightening its links with customers and diversifying its revenues. But the platform's success has opened up new challenges. Competitors are fast developing rival platforms that are taking some of its business. The system's scale, unparalleled for technology offered by a fund manager, has also created possible conflicts of interest. Most of all, its importance as a fintech hub has raised the prospect of a regulatory backlash. Yeah, that's quite interesting there, though, that even in the inflationary environment we exist in, where the S&P 500 has been doing silly numbers since about 2014, 2015, BlackRock is still so much bigger.
It's almost unfathomable how large they are as a firm. It's you can't conceive of it almost. Yet after the financial crisis, a regulatory push sought to label certain large banks and insurers as systematically important. Asset managers were expected to be included in the list, but the larger companies lobbied hard to avoid the decision. They were ultimately successful based on one single argument. Investors who entrust fund managers with their assets technically hold them with one of a small group of specialist banks, so the assets are never on fund managers' balance sheets. This is the trick I was talking about. They are the managerialists of this money. They don't actually hold this money, and that's how they're able to not be overseen by the regulatory environment.
Because it's not about making profits, it's about growing how much money they manage.
Yes. I want to go down a section here. I want to skip over a little bit, sorry. Though Aladdin does not tell asset managers what to buy or sell, some argue that if a large portion of global assets respond to the warnings that Aladdin gives off, trillions of dollars will react to events such as the outbreak of a pandemic or a war in the Middle East. In the same in the same way, causing dangerous herding behavior. The more investment managers and asset owners rely on Aladdin to gauge risk, the less responsible they become for their portfolio decisions. Basically, if they were to move some parameters, say a small percentage in the software, and then they were able to predict how their software would behave in a situation they themselves are in a position to create with the funds that they manage, they can effectively create a crash from which only they benefit, like 2008.
Here's basically two separate sort of institutions making a point here. This concern was highlighted by Los Angeles County Employees Retirement Association, the $58 billion US pension fund, in January. It cited the potential for groupthink as one reason it declined Aladdin's risk capabilities. Anything close to an oligopoly in risk management would be especially dangerous if there were any weakness in the system. I mean, it's such a simple point. If one person or one entity is the entity that gets to assign the risk of everything, then how do we know what the risk is that their risk calculation is too risky or not risky enough?
Yeah, they're talking about the tech revenue reaching $1 billion a year, blah blah blah. It's probably over that now. But I think that this should really start to impress upon people the ubiquity and the monopoly that Aladdin has. I want to move on to a slightly earlier article. This is from 2013, actually.
Yeah, this is one from The Economist. I think.
Do you want to read this one?
I do. I have to. I do like the casually just depicting this sort of aspect of financial software and hardware as the monolith from 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yes.
I think that this has much of the same thing. It's just I thought that the tone in this was quite interesting. Again, there's a lot of the same history here, but Blackrock, about Larry Fink, the $5 million loan, blah 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 blah. I mean, this is from 2013, and it here
Yeah.
says Aladdin keeps its eyes on almost 7% of the world's $225 trillion of financial assets. And I'm almost certain that's pretty much doubled by now. God, I forgot how much of the just like the same history stuff we've already gone over is in this article. Yeah, because they go on to call it like the Sentinel. There is another way that BlackRock is singularly important. A recent report by the Office of Financial Research, an arm of the US Treasury, contained a warning that the asset managers, which provide consulting or pricing services to other asset managers, are creating interconnections and dependencies that increase their importance in financial markets. And through Aladdin, BlackRock provides such services on an epic scale. Who
Glow in the
exactly?
dark with a $2 donation though is pretty funny there. It said Aladdin is a fictional thief.
Aladdin
This
the
Aladdin,
virtual thief,
yeah,
yeah.
that's pretty good.
Who exactly pays to gain the system's insight is not a matter of record, but a fair number of BlackRock's asset management's rivals use it, as do banks, pension funds, and insurers. Deutsche Bank, it must have worked well for them using this stuff, investment arm which manages nearly $1 trillion, announced in November, or sorry, nearly €1 trillion, November, that it was they'd be the same now anyway. So what difference does it make?
Yep.
Announced in November that it was migrating to the platform, including those of BlackRock itself. Aladdin keeps track of 30,000 investment portfolios. Some of the clients use the risk management services. About a third use Aladdin to manage their portfolios and process trades too. The $400
Again,
million
this is 2013.
Yeah, the $400 million the company can expect in annual fees from outside users goes a long way to making the cost of the system and nearly 2,000 employees who run it.
I want to read this last bit of that article there because
Are you right at the bottom here, or the broken circuit bit?
it's right at the bottom. It's God, if I think I accidentally closed it. Sorry. It's just like the last paragraph. It's very, very, very
I can
good.
read that if you want. It's just the
Oh,
Black.
there we go. BlackRock's perpetually neurotic outlook still looks like something that would have served the world well in 2008 had it been wider spread. But one lesson of the crisis was that the investors needed to do their own legwork. If models are always wrong, as BlackRock posits, it should perhaps be a little worried that so many people are using the ones it offers. Maybe it is a source of correlation Aladdin should be asked to look out for. That's kind of funny. It's very cliched. Who washes the washing? It's a fair point that if everyone's using the exact same model, then they're all going to fail. It's going to create a situation which we might be seeing relatively soon that will make 2008 look like a picnic.
No, essentially. Shall we go on to the next Reuters link? We are getting on a bit here. We'll see if we can get this
We
done before
It's fine.
half
I'd
past.
like we can go to half past. This is a more complex one, so I'd like to run a little
Yeah.
bit longer. I think an extra half an hour is needed here. Uh, what all this adds up to, though, is we've seen the creation of BlackRock basically from nothing through Larry Fink's personal and government connections to become this large asset manager, to then become a huge client and beneficiary of an opaque process in which it is essentially nominated as the funnel through which the financial bailout of 2008 is put through. And then they are then put in the position after that of being the default assigner of what is and isn't financial risk. And they are done so with the explicit blessing of the American government. And their Aladdin software has become essentially what people pass the buck to when they're trying to do these risk assessments, and they're chopping up all these financial instruments and these complex bonds and these trackers that they sell people that most people have no idea that they own. But the other aspect here is that when you get into this position when you take on the role and the debt of people like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This is again from 2010, but even back then, BlackRock fund to finance securitized US mortgages. They were doing it again. Even as soon as 2010, they were going back to that well and they were securitizing mortgages and talking about how they're providing a credit boom to the housing market, and
But
they're trying to,
it's not even that they're engaging in a trade of these things and adding value to them. It's that they're making them. It's that they're
yes,
packaging this stuff up. They are possibly one of the major origins of all these sort of fiduciary media, both prior to and after the housing market crash in 2007, 2008.
yes. I'll just read this. It says BlackRock fund will this month begin financing U.S. home loans customized for a new breed of residential mortgage-backed securities that avoids the conflicts tainting many of today's private issues. The $1 billion BlackRock Mortgage Investment Fund will provide capital for prime jumbo loans through lenders under strict underwriting guarantees. But basically, they're saying, I know this failed last time, but we're doing it for real this time. The
Wait,
loans will be earmarked for bonds akin to Wall Street's private label RMBS that provided the majority of credit at the peak of the housing boom. But BlackRock says it is addressing the weaknesses of the old model that have frustrated investors, including sloppy loan documentation and potential conflicts when the same bank is originator and servicer. But that's exactly what BlackRock is and more. They are originator, servicer, valuer, broker, buyer, and seller. And they also create the software through which all of that's evaluated.
Yeah, we're really designing this to alleviate many of those concerns, Robertson said. We hope to achieve the bellwether non-agency prime securities ultimately. It is a new twist by The Worlds. God, they've had a decade and a bit to fix this article and they still haven't. It's a new twist by the world's largest money manager, which created the BMI fund to purchase distressed mortgage assets. The fund, part of BlackRock's $3.5 trillion under management, expects initially to support $100 million to $250 million a quarter, which is basically them being a private form of bloody QE at this point. Throwing $250 million a quarter at the housing slump to fix it, knowing that they can do it because they value it on the other end at the end of the month anyway, so they can just make up the valuation to make it worth what they spent on it that month.
It's not that BlackRock owns and manages a massive amount of property, it's that it also owns the bonds that are issued in relation to your mortgage. It like the South Park episode with the chicken and blah 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 blah. Basically, BlackRock owns your house.
Well, yeah, no. If you can't pay your mortgage, BlackRock owns your house, not the bank, because it's not the bank only owns the securitized debt, which they can only hold insofar as the debt is paid. Once the debt isn't paid by the individual that owns the house and pays the mortgage, then it all defaults back to the original person that securitized the debt, BlackRock.
So not only has BlackRock become a government department servicing and managing their huge bailout, not only have they become the default evaluation platform for what is and isn't risky financial undertaking, they have also stepped into the void left by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to securitize the mortgage market and have been doing so since 2010. They've essentially absorbed all of the toxic elements of 2008 and put them into this massive quasi-governmental entity that is spewing them back out in the world, but calling them safe now. And they have been able to.
It's the whole thing here about like jumbo mortgages and jumbo lending as well. I mean, this was basically a way to throw. They're talking about here. Currently, jumbo lending is constrained as many borrowers do not qualify, and lenders are wary of expensive properties when forecasts call for further price depreciation. This was not happening even in 2010, 2011. Those prices were already starting to tick up. Lenders must securitize or hold in portfolio loans with balances above a temporary cap of nearly $750,000 in government-backed loans, which, if I'm right in saying, is basically this, this free money that was sloshing around wasn't actually for the poor people. It was for people who
No.
got stung on their ninth house in 2008 and had to sell two houses and only had seven left, and then wanted to buy $1 million eighth house when it was cheap in 2010. And BlackRock said, "Here you go, take that money, go and
Uh,
do that."
Sorry, Glowy donated $3 via Streamlabs and said, "I bet financial big data algorithm is just the same as a social credit, the social media algorithm. It will be shaped by its creators to get the results they want." Well, exactly. Machines can only do what humans tell them. And Glow in the Dark, another $2 donation said, "BlackRock uses circular financing," which it does. It very much is this kind of shell game of them creating this cycle which they control basically every step.
And then what happens once they have control? They can put their agenda into force. This is an interesting one here. It's from some finance research outlet, IMD or whatever.
Well, we're getting into some of the epilogue here, really.
Yes.
We've gone through really, I think, how BlackRock became the monster it is via the 2008 financial crisis, almost purely.
Mm.
It, without that event, BlackRock would not exist in its current form, and was only able to do what it did because it was the entity of choice in almost all aspects by the federal government. They have been chosen as a massive winner by the personal friends of Larry Fink without any bidding process, without any transparency, and really without any public knowledge until now. This was not talked about at the time, and they were able to do so not through, as a lot of people claim, genius financial decisions. They were handed it on a plate through government contracts, as is what happened to Google, as is what happened to Amazon. All of these big firms, all of them, are not successful through the market. They are purely government invented entities. And if you research them and you look at their histories, that becomes incredibly apparent. It's very important to. A lot of people are like, why isn't the government doing something about BlackRock? BlackRock is the government,
Yeah, it's the
and
public-private
much more.
partnership. But no, that
It,
I just think it's so, it makes so much more sense long term when you think about the position BlackRock has played. It was there to be the fall guy. It was there to be the guy that does the dirty work, and then they profited off the dirty work and accrued ridiculous amounts of power and control. Never mind profit. That's ancillary to these people. And what that has meant is BlackRock has this sort of massive web of influence across all of global finance. And once you start to slot the ESG score stuff and diversity, equality, and inclusion and green policy, it gives that stuff so much more teeth because the market wouldn't adapt to these things normally. But if 13% of everything in the market is actually just in some way, shape, or form BlackRock, then 13% of the market will have these standards forced upon them in a market way. And then it's just a matter of time from then, really. I mean, it's kind of interesting here in this short article they've got, the BlackRock letter, a turning point for real change. Although greenwashing is far too common, recently there have been two powerful green shoots, which show that business is finally taking sustainability a lot more seriously. Most recently, Larry Fink, founder of investment management giant BlackRock, wrote in his 2018 letter to chief executive officers that to prosper over time, every company must not only deliver financial performance, but also show how it makes a positive contribution to society. Companies must benefit all of their stakeholders, including shareholders, employees, customers, and the communities in which they operate. Here's the WEF crap. There's that straight away. It's so funny how Larry Fink goes from
Zoom,
this.
please.
Yeah, sorry, I should have. Larry Fink goes from this sort of like renegade finance figure, big shot, biggest swinging dick in the room, blah blah blah, to like all of a sudden he's like the peaceful church choir boy that's like,
He's doing a Mother Teresa impression.
yeah,
He has gone through, the arrogant bond broker to the behind the scenes hatchet man and consigliere,
yeah.
much in the same way that Bill Gates
Yeah, they're going on
has done.
here. We would also argue that companies need to identify clearly how their business model creates value and rewards critical stakeholders, i.e., how it doesn't make profit and uses its power and influence to reorganize society. i.e., not
Well,
be a business, be a government.
what becomes important to wrap this all up in a bow when you look at a system like Aladdin and you look at BlackRock becoming the default valuer of debt, when you get the ESG scores and when you get the social credit stuff, they are able to build that into things like Aladdin, and they are
Yeah.
able to make the quote unquote benefit over profit model that they define. They're able to bake it into risk management, which I will remind people is something that balance sheets have to consider by law. They become the legal definer of what is and isn't financially viable.
Well, no, again, this is another one we can maybe post to like. It's just there's a couple of points in here where they're essentially sort of subtly admitting that because of the influence of BlackRock, uh, just for example, 75% of top executives in investment firms agree that a company's good sustainability performance is materially important to their firm when making investment decisions. Why would this be? Because the company above them that influences their investment decisions wants investment decisions to line up with its green agenda. It's just that simple.
Well, there's also a funny thing. It says investors are willing to divest for sustainability reasons. 75% of investment firm board members, not investors, investment firm board members, these are the people who are the investors now. There's
Hmm.
no such thing as a retail investor anymore. When all this guff comes out about investors
Uh,
wanting green uh,
find that
products,
line.
nobody, it's at the bottom, nobody is actually asking for them in the market.
No.
What's happening is that the investment firm board members are asking for them. It is the people in the middle, the middlemen are the ones pushing this, not the retail investor. One more donation, thank you, Glinda Dark. Government wants control, but they can't. They can't by their own law, so they build up a sock puppet corporation to do whatever it wants. It's the same story we talked about in democratization. It's the same picking of winners that started happening really under Teddy Roosevelt, accelerated massively under Woodrow Wilson, and reached its zenith really in an outward fashion with FDR.
Hmm.
This is what becomes of that style of government. You can draw a straight line from the war between um, kind of the uh, oh God damn it, I can't remember the name of the big financial families of the
Oh, you're talking
1910s.
about the Wall Street versus Main Street
Yeah, the
and
Rockefeller versus it's not
Morgans
Goldman.
and
Yeah, the Rockefeller versus Morgan Stanley, and the government side, the government shadow boxing, with these two interests in mind, is where this all comes from, really. And it
yeah.
previously was impossible because previously the things like the Federal Reserve didn't exist.
God,
The
I've just opened the Vox article you linked and I don't want to read it.
oh
Wall
no, I
Wall Street isn't to blame for the chaotic housing market. The boogeyman isn't who you want it to be.
I mean this is Vox Media chief Yas Queen Rainbow Flag Waver.
Ugh.
Um, it's really funny that they go on to. I just want to read a little bit of this. Um,
Yeah, by the way, all the conservative people on fucking Twitter bagging on BlackRock, how many of them are going to actually tell you the origin story of where the company came from, like we did earlier on?
are they going to talk about Little Israel?
Nah.
It's-
Is there a specific bit of this you're wanting to
oh,
read? Oh
I'm
God,
trying to
the
find
birth
it.
of the single-family home institutional investor.
Um,
Jesus.
it's the bit above the Jake Anbender tweet that they're linking. Um, I just
Yes.
want to read that paragraph because it's amazing. Um, It's it's where the tweets are linked basically. It's sandwiched between the two
Yeah.
tweets. It says investors go where the yield is, if you can see that.
Yeah, no, I've got it.
Yeah, investors go where the yield is. They are profit maximizers and face strong pressure to retain large gains to shareholders. Want them to stop? Build more homes. Ensure they cannot have a large market share and engage in predatory behavior and reduce the incentive for yield chasers to further commodify the market. Basically what they're saying is just build your own housing market.
Oh,
Like
that's
that is the
terrible.
most like passive aggressive. Well, why don't you just stop them then? It's so terrible. Like that the paragraph in isolation is just so awful on its own. There's one more I wanted to. There's just a couple more simpering examples here before we close out.
Well, this article's bloody
There's a
long as well. This is
yeah,
some
there's
amount
a
of apologia.
yeah,
This isn't even getting on your knees. This is over the barrel and all sorts.
yeah. It is ridiculous. Apologism.
We've got the
They are
insider
basically
one. The internet loves Blackrock conspiracy theories. Meet the man behind the firm's social media strategy, trying to edge out bad headlines and reach new investors. But he does a lot of edging. Look at him, the fucking freak.
It's very correct. The record. BlackRock does have its own like 50
Rich Latter,
yuan army.
global head of content and media, joined the firm from Goldman Sachs in 2019.
Oh dear. The
Let's
face
get
that touched
let's get
1,000
the
kids.
early life on Richard Latour real quick.
God,
it's the same history of
yep.
BlackRock and TikTok.
It's just puff piece here. God, they're talking about the next generation investors, stakeholders. How do you do, fellow kids? We're not an evil corporation.
Yeah, the Zoomer investors.
There's no like critical eye. It's literally just a business inside a puff piece for BlackRock. The final one I want to finish on though, before I read the last little bit of that Vanity Fair article, because that last paragraph is amazing. Is this Reuters fact? This spitting, simpering, toady fact check here from Reuters. Saying fact check video claiming BlackRock and Vanguard own all the biggest corporations in the world is missing context. A video claiming BlackRock and Vanguard blah 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 is missing context. While it is true that both investment firms hold significant shares in many of the world's leading companies and can therefore wield voting rights, shares are ultimately owned by BlackRock and Vanguard's clients. So the word that they're taking issue with there is own. It's like, no, they don't own all the biggest corporations. They just manage them and have voting rights on them. It's such like a transparent, like, you're a conspiracy theorist because we've reframed the question, and they can't even defend it. It's so like it's like the glasses nerd emoji. It is very actively.
However, spokespeople for both firms told Reuters that while they do appear to own significant shares in the world's biggest businesses, those shares are purchased using money belonging to the clients, and therefore the shareholders are ultimately their clients.
BlackRock
itself. They say the same thing. BlackRock itself is not a shareholder, a company's spokesperson told Reuters, adding that the money being managed or invested belongs to our clients. The owners of these securities are our clients, though their investments made on their behalf via the funds managed by BlackRock. A Vanguard spokesperson told Reuters that its firm was mutually owned, meaning the firm is owned by its funds, which in turn are owned by its investors.
It's go down to the voting rights bit because there's an amazing bit there too. Yeah. Both Professor Edmonds and Franklin Allen, a professor of finance and economics at Imperial College London, told Reuters they did not believe people should be concerned about Vanguard and BlackRock having significant shares in large. So just don't worry about it, guys. And they don't even elaborate. They just say, "Oh yeah, these leading."
And then in the paragraph down here, as company shareholders, BlackRock and Vanguard can vote on behalf of their clients at company shareholder meetings. Both firms also have investment stewardship functions, which enables the proxy votes, probably at a premium price, I would imagine. BlackRock's spokesperson said the votes can also be carried out by a portfolio manager, and in some cases, at BlackRock, can be carried out by the clients themselves.
It's like, there's all these hoops you have to jump through. Verdict, missing context. BlackRock and Vanguard do not own all the biggest corporations in the world. They invest trillions of dollars into leading companies on behalf of their clients, who ultimately own the shares. The article was produced by Reuters fact check. It's such like simpering cover for the regime.
Hmm.
It's so awful and transparent, and is meant to just. I don't think that would even pacify anybody. It's almost like ritual humiliation.
Well, I think
Like no,
most people would read this and just not know what's going on. Let's be honest.
yeah, it's
So,
meant to confuse people, really. Ultimately,
uh,
um,
Vanity Fair article. I'm just going back to this. Again,
yeah.
we must state that if you've got 10, 15 minutes, like tomorrow morning when you're, doing your dues, riding the porcelain
As we are.
lorry, you give this a read. Do you want to start from a lifelong Democrat or just
Yes, I
a?
do.
I thought you might.
Yeah. Oh, yes, I would very much like to
See, I
start from the
wish they just
paragraph.
said that in the Wikipedia early life. Larry Fink was born to a Democrat family.
Is that the new euphemism now?
Yeah.
A in quotes lifelong Democrat, Fink can sometimes sound like a populist, which he is not.
uh,
Whilst he does not believe that the government bailout in 2008 was quote unquote fair, everyone benefited, but a few firms benefited but you're in charge of the biggest beneficiary. He also roundly endorses both Paulson and of course he does. They made him rich. Who he says will come out in the history of two of our best Treasury secretaries.
uh,
The part of the public's rage at Wall Street today is driven by a need to externalize the enemy, he says. that line, that line is just like the public's rage is is based around trying to externalize the enemy. But I don't like pointing fingers because I feel it was the culture of America that was guilty. We were living fat and happy. You still there, Evelyn?
yeah.
Oh, sorry. We were living fat and happy, and the whole system was one of excess, speculation, and leverage. It's the American, it's America itself who was guilty. It wasn't.
Yeah.
It don't.
I've not gone quiet. I'm taking this all in. I mean, this last sentence I've got here, maybe getting back to knowing your risk, has happened to me at First Boston. We should have all been asking why people were making so much money.
He said it.
The
Again. It's like ritual humiliation.
the
The
ins.
insider and the
Oh, shall
sorry,
you or
the
shall
insider
I?
and the outsider, Larry Fink has walked the fine line between the two for years, and BlackRock's enormous power and success owe much to his high wire act, not the fact that he knows the Treasury secretaries.
His
Friends
golden
maintain that
Rolodex.
that he is golden Rolodex.
Let's see.
His
That is a true early life check. Are you a lifelong Democrat with a golden Rolodex?
Yeah, his friends maintain he is intensely driven to be seen as important, but not just important, more like a man in a white hat coming to the rescue. Although he insists, I do not have the skill set to be the next Treasury Secretary, which isn't exactly a no in the hallways of power. If there is indeed an American oligarchy today, it does seem as if Larry Fink wants to be the good oligarch,
God,
which would be
it's
the
all of a sudden
ultimate.
become a Yarvin article.
Yes, it has. It's those two together, him talking about the externalization of the enemy, the good oligarch. It's very, I am an elite, I am an elf.
Yes,
It's,
but it's also like very clear from that last sentence there that he was he was in the process of being groomed for some form of power move that he had to basically sacrifice himself to play the role of. And that appears nowadays to be basically chief bummer of progressive finance projects and environmental finance projects, and that is his dues that he has to pay now because they've given him everything he probably wanted.
well, between him and the FTC, that's really where the ESG push is coming from.
Hmm.
It's the regulatory one-two punch, but it's also the fact that BlackRock just owns the entire market. That they are really the only game in town.
Yep.
But I think we've gone kind of from A to B to C. We've had to add a lot of stuff to the Vanity Fair article, really, because it doesn't have the right punches. It can't say too much. Even back in 2010, you have to get into the context of what's happened since. If you were to rewrite that article today in 2022, you couldn't. If you added all the context to what came after and the power, that they've accrued in that 12-year period, even before current year of 2015, they were talked about as this monolith, this mega corporation 12 years ago, and they have only exponentially grown since, and yet the criticism of them has almost dried up entirely. You cannot find an article outside of a couple of maybe buried pieces in FT like we found that has the tone of that Vanity Fair article now. It is basically impossible to find outward, full-throated criticism of Blackrock that isn't debunked by the mainstream media and considered right-wing, fringe, and yes, in some way anti-Semitic.
Well, I mean, when I was looking through this stuff, I have to admit, I've run out of things to comment on because I think so much of it really should just speak for itself, quite frankly. But
It,
when I
oh,
tried looking some of this stuff up, I mean, I found a Vanity Fair article which I thought, right, this is a belter, and some of the other Reuters piece which put the story together. But if you want to find like transcripts of these meetings, you want to find, annual letters from to BlackRock shareholders in 2007, 2008, it's not there. What you will find is, SEC disclosure papers that are hundreds of pages just full of numbers. And maybe someone more au fait with specific American financial stuff can pick something apart from that and learn something. But it is, it is almost impossible to find exactly what these people were thinking, doing, and saying in 2008. All we have is stuff from 2010 that sort of slightly uncovers what was going on and
yeah, and
requires you to infer about knowledge about the events of 2008 themselves and the players that were involved and the links, as we've shown, between all these different articles and the characters that were described to piece the whole sort of story together and understand that, it is through handling, a quote unquote crisis like this that power brokers are made, really. They're groomed into their positions and basically given the sort of golden shackles.
it's also very much veiled in technocracy and technical knowledge. You have to know what a credit default swap is. You have to know what an ETF is. You have to know what the Treasury Secretary does. You have to know what risk management is. You have to know partially how Wall Street works. You have to know, what the Barclays Investment Bank was and who Bear Stearns were and the significance of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and how mortgage-backed securities function, how debt securities function in general, how securitization functions. It is something that is not within reach of average people by design. And again, we have a relatively well-versed audience. We're relatively well-versed people. We are very, we are kind of political addicts almost in this way. We consume this, we analyze it, and we comb through it. But even in the way we presented it here, I think a lot of people who would consider themselves relatively financially literate, who are, more in the normal sphere, and I hate using the term normie because it doesn't exist. Normies aren't real. They're homo normicus. But people who aren't engaged, people who are not following this on a day-to-day basis, people who are maybe a bit fuzzy about what happened in 2008, they probably wouldn't be able to grasp the enormity of what we talked about here, even though we tried to do it in very simple terms, tried to use analogies, tried to talk people through the technical language we're using. It's extremely difficult to understand what BlackRock does and why BlackRock is so important and why its private-public partnership is so integral to how it's become what it is.
We'll see as well
It
that
takes
this further plays into, and maybe it's sort of the point we can round it off. When you look at stuff from the World Economic Forum, you look at the things that people like Larry Fink are talking about now. They know they set the pieces in motion to start this stuff off over a decade ago. They know they did it, but they're
yes,
talking to you nowadays like they're doing it now. No,
yeah,
and this is something we've said repeatedly with all the stuff about the UN sustainable goals, but the government's, carbon neutral policy and all this kind of stuff. The reason why you're being told about it now publicly is because it was set in motion more than a decade ago, and there's no
It's
turning it
already
back.
happened.
Yeah.
What we're talking about as BlackRock now is what BlackRock was in 2008.
Hmm.
The discussion about BlackRock is essentially 14 years behind really where it should be. And we don't need to be talking about it like it was then. We need to be talking about it like it is now, which I think we partially started to do. Like we need to start integrating all the rewilding stuff and investigate that. Like all of this it feels conspiratorial, but it will be talked about in a matter of fact way 10 years from now. Like,
Well,
oh
no,
yeah, that happened.
there was a direct link between this sort of stuff and then what we talked about in the previous week about like the sort of green imperialism and basically starving and collapsing the third world, so that they now need even greater population measures of population control in the West when these people immigrate here. And who will be the people that are doing the numbers for the pension schemes to find out if the valuation is right? It'll be Larry Fink, it'll be BlackRock. There'll be people handing the numbers to the government that says, well, you need another 2 million people to come into Britain over the next 5 years, otherwise you'll never afford the pension liabilities or some nonsense like that.
I also hope people understand the wider context of why you can't just vote in a more populist Tory or a DeSantis figure on the Republican ticket and have this be solved. That if you try and work within the system, what will happen is you will have BlackRock come out and basically say that your government bonds are racist and therefore high risk,
Yep.
and you will not be able to raise money on the money markets until you comply with them. And that's why, really, as we try and encourage people, you need to disengage fully from the systematizing of money. You need to disengage fully from all of these systems that have been set up in a way that, I don't want to beat the drum for them, but in a way that Russia has tried to do. They've realized that they are not compatible and shouldn't be compatible with Western economies. It's what China is going to start doing relatively soon, where they will essentially firewall off their areas of interest and not allow Western finance to engage with it at all because of the toxic effects it will have. I'm not sure if China can actually pull that off because they're so intrinsically linked with Western finance. I don't want to critique him, but earlier today, AA was doing a stream in which he was admonishing people for calling China a paper tiger, but it's not so much that China is a paper tiger. In many areas they have been exaggerated, but really they're a tiger on a Western leash,
Mm-hmm.
and people need to appreciate the amount of assistance that is given to them on a daily basis by their supposed enemies. It's very 5-year plan. It's very money given to Lenin and Stalin by General Electric in the West. It's the same thing. It's the same thing that's been going on for over 100 years. It's a self-perpetuating machine. It creates its own enemies, and you have to know that. You have to know where the hegemony is and how it keeps China in some ways dangerous looking, but almost caged and fed. Not quite. They do have their own agenda, and they do have the ability to go rogue if they feel that they need to. But it's something that you should keep in mind when you look at BlackRock and you look at all of the systematizing of the financial system. Oh, sorry, of finance itself, of money, of the concept of exchange, is that you cannot reform within that framework. It is by definition and by design impossible. And that's kind of the totality of what our content tries to add up to when you look at your essays, my essays, the speeches we've given in person, the stuff we talk about that's more theory based. It all gels together with this. These are the real world examples. This is we need to show people how the sausage gets made. It can't all be theory. But when you mesh this stuff with the theory stuff, with the democratization stuff, as people have started to do, you are able to build a much more powerful, functioning model of how the world actually works in your head. And through that, you're able to make better decisions and better filter reality. That is a slightly lofty goal, but that is the goal of what I want to try and make this channel about. Is a lot of people in the rightoid sphere just surface level herder clown world it, and they don't understand the utility of the confusion of quote unquote clown world because they can't filter the reality. All they see is the circus. They don't see the stuff behind the scenes. It seems very basic, explaining how Blackrock benefited from the financial crisis, but with the framework around it, with all the reading, the theory, the elite theory stuff, you start to see how we ended up in this current situation and where things might be going from here.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I have little to add. I've been a bit brain foggy for the last few days anyway, so doing this stream for the last 2.5 hours is pushing my limits. I have
Is
also
it taxing your spoons?
I have also cooked a rather great dinner today though. I was very satisfied with it. I made
Oh, well done.
the usual mince and tatties, but I used a pilsner that was spare in the fridge to make the mince.
Ooh.
Very
Well,
good.
I will make sure that I haven't missed any super chats here. Um,
I
Another
think
donation from Glowy. You've been donating a lot today. Thank you very much. He said the
yes,
people
very
that gave
generous.
over voting rights to another person, actually the people in charge. Blackrock votes for these things, but they aren't in control. It's very democracy.
Mm.
In fact, I've seen in multiple publications. I think we found it during our last reading about Blackrock. They used the term democratization in
Yes.
relation to Blackrock, and I actually like audibly made noise about that. That was it actually hurts. It feels like they're looking into the camera and winking at us, like directly.
I
But
think as well we're probably worth chucking the contents of the Google document either into a community post or the pinned comment once this stream has gone up as well.
I will do that pretty much now. I will put that as a community post, and then yes, it will also be a pinned comment. So look out for that if you guys want to read along and do your own research.
Well,
Thank you guys for coming.
yeah, I was gonna say just
Um,
keep an eye out. I'll give you some. We'll give you some reading over the weekend so you can view my Shieldings essay from last year. I'm not exactly sure what the plan will be next week. We can maybe try and squeeze out a stream on Monday or maybe early Tuesday if we come up with
yes.
something.
I'd like to do, before we say goodbye properly, a quick handover.
Ah, yes.
Radical Liberation has been streaming for the past about 40 minutes. You might have missed a little bit, but we like to do little handovers on this stream. So if you want to go over there and say that, oh, apparently he's having a boomer moment. He's muted himself.
Oh no.
Go over there and tell him Scrump says you are a boomer. Let's go raid Radical Liberation. Go say hi.
Tell them we sent
Yeah,
you.
yeah, tell them we sent you and tell them they're being a boomer because they seem to have muted themselves currently. Um, anyway, I will talk to you guys again at some point. Uh, it's there we go. Sorry, I'm laughing at them being muted. I will see you guys again later.
Good evening.
Yes, good evening and good night.